Good morning. My name is Maria Doyle, and it is with great pleasure to welcome you all to the Race and Resiliency Talks on behalf of all of us here at New Hampshire Children's Trust. First, some housekeeping. This is a Zoom webinar, not a Zoom meeting that most of you are probably familiar with. So that's why the participants are not on video, that you didn't hear audio until we start. Your own audio is muted, and you can't see what's entered into the chat. But know that we can see it, and that's the place to let us know if you're having any technical questions. If you'd like to ask a question of the panelists or make a comment, we encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If the presenters see a question about which they need more detail, you may receive a written message on your screen giving you the option to unmute and say more. You may see one or more presenter on the screen in addition to the PowerPoint presentation. You can adjust the sizes of your screen according to your preference, and if you don't know how to do that, you can ask us in chat and we'll walk you through it. We are also offering closed captioning for this webinar. If you would like to see the captions, there is a closed caption button at the bottom of your screen that will enable the captions. If you don't want to see them, you can use that button to turn them off as well. Please note that the closed captioning is being done live, so there will be a slight delay. If you have questions about closed captioning, you can ask those in the chat as well. We are pleased that this event qualified for CEUs and professional development for a number of licensed and certified professionals. You can find more information about that in the program booklet, which is available on our website, and you should have received it via an email that you would have received prior to the start of today's event. Certificates of attendance for today will be available for those who complete an evaluation. We encourage everyone to visit the evaluation survey, whether you are earning CEUs today or not, because we really do listen to your feedback. The survey link will pop up in the conclusion, right after the conclusion of the webinar, and also you'll receive it via email. This event is a reimagining of sorts of New Hampshire Children's Trust annual Strengthening Family Summit, which was scheduled to happen in April. We so look forward to annually convening those of you who spend your time strengthening families and communities to ensure that children have safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments. We were so excited about that event, particularly because we had invited two great speakers, both nationally recognized for their work building protective factors and equipping others to do so. So then 2020 happened, and life as we knew it came to a screeching halt. Concerns over the novel coronavirus put any plans of convening, let's face it, any plans at all, on hold. And assuring safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments for children has taken on whole new meanings. But parents, teachers, home visitors, family resource centers, childcare programs, and others have all reimagined what it means to support families to be their best. Times have demanded creativity and for us to be dynamic and resilient. The role of protective factors in our lives has never been more apparent. And while we've been facing the adjustments necessary because of the pandemic, a number of events this year have demanded that we confront the systemic racism that exists in our world. While some of us know too well the myriad and omnipresent ways that racism shows up on a daily basis, others are accepting the invitation these times have presented to take responsibility for confronting injustice in ways that they may not have before. While thousands join together to demand justice and equity, it becomes apparent that this journey begins inward, in understanding history, learning about our own biases, owning the power of your voice, and deciding how to use it. This year, we have seen too many families lose loved ones in acts of violence that too vividly spotlight the work that remains to be done. When I see family members publicly display strength and courage when they could justifiably only focus on their own private grief, I am inspired by the grace and resilience made apparent through their public calls for justice, unity, and equity. So as we explored what sort of convening New Hampshire Children's Trust could hold this year, there was no better choice than to come together to explore two topics that are so intertwined. So we welcome you today to the Race and Resiliency Talks, featuring the two speakers that were originally scheduled to speak at our summit in April. Before introducing our speakers, I want to thank the sponsors whose generous support help make today possible. You'll see them listed on our sponsor slide. I want to give very special thanks to our presenting sponsor, the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. During the breaks, you will hear a short message from Tim Rourke, the Charitable Foundation's Director of New Hampshire Tomorrow. We encourage you to check that out. And you'll also see some information of the work of New Hampshire Children's Trust and some of our valued partners. Next, I want to share a little bit about our learning objectives for today. I'll give you a second to read those. But we, as always, want you to we hope you increase your knowledge about the Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework and increase your understanding of resilience, and also have an opportunity to deepen your understanding of racism and equity practice. And we always hope that you walk away with strategies to build resilience through equitable and authentic practice. And we invite you to let us know by completing an evaluation whether we meet these objectives today. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers today. Corey Best will begin our day with Hearts, Minds, and Humanity. Some of you may have seen Corey speak last year at the New Hampshire DCYF conference. Corey is a father, a parent leader, a trainer, an activist, and an advocate. His innovative style and approach led him to receive the 2016 Casey Family Program's Excellence for Children Award. Corey believes that a leader must have a set of values and behaviors that embrace diversity, shared power, and social contribution in order to see lasting changes in systems that serve our children. In addition to consulting for the Children's Trust Fund Alliance and being a certified trainer in their Bringing the Protective Factors framework to life in your work curriculum, he also serves as a community curator for Mining for Gold, LLC. I have always enjoyed the opportunities that I've had to hear from and work with Corey, and I'm eager for all of you to hear from him today. Later today, we'll hear from Pat Stanislawski. Pat is the Director of Partnering for Prevention, a consulting firm. She has presented to audiences around the world about the importance of empathy and resilience in the development of strong children and families. She will speak to us today about resilience by considering the question, why do some bounce back while some never do? I was privileged to meet Pat when she led the training that I attended to become a trainer in the Children's Trust Fund's Alliance's training on the Strengthening Families framework. And I was struck by her candor, her down-to-earth nature, her expertise, and her humor. I know you will enjoy hearing from her later today. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn things over to Corey Best for Hearts, Minds, and Humanity. Thank you, Corey.
Well, thank you so much, Maria, for that generous opening. As I begin to share my screen here, there we are. I want to welcome everybody to the conversation. And it is such a delight to really share this opportunity with Pat. I won't go into a lot of detail, but Pat and I, we have a pretty extensive history. Pat also trained me in the protective factors, and a lot of what my conversation will be centered around is how resilience is also formed in spite of racial discrimination. So this is really an honor, and I miss the opportunity to be with you all. I understand that these are definitely trying times, and it is, not as important to think about what we can't do and to face the challenges that we're up against. It's a matter of, as Maria said, reimagining what is actually possible. And that begins with sort of the pull, hearts, minds, and humanity. When I think about heart, the emotional aspect, the minds, and our abilities to think about humanity and its wholeness, go back to my grandmother. My grandmother is 82 years young. She is diagnosed terminal, and she's really, really active, right? She focuses on the quality of life. But my grandmother also has a lot of experiences as a child with racial difference. And what I mean by that is, at a very young age, I recognized that we in the world were polarized and shaped by race. I didn't know exactly what that meant by 10 years old, but I knew that I viewed the world one way and others viewed me as the world told them I was. So I learned by the time that I was in the 6th grade that there was a structure, a narrative of Black and Brown individuals, as well as a narrative of white Americans as well. My grandmother told me multiple stories. So the gist is she was only a seat away from the dinner table for me to get history lessons. Many of us pick up books, learn about historical occurrences to understand why history has shaped our present and how we've even gotten to where we are. Again, those stories resonate with me till today, and a large part of my conversation will be from experiences and also the oral history of how my family and other families that look like me actually travel and navigate this world through cultural orientation and learn to be more resilient in a world that often has not seen equity or justice just yet. And there's a part of reimagining justice and racial equities. First, we have to understand the system of inequities. I think what we're attempting to build, create, reimagine is something that we've never seen before. Circa 1776, when America formed its identity, we have not, from that very moment, and I won't go back too far in history, but we haven't from that very moment seen justice. And so what does it look like? Where does it begin? How do we do this with all of the emotional, the soul work, the connection, the changes that we see in the world? So I want to ground us just a little bit and have us recognize, one, that we are on stolen indigenous land. I am calling or speaking from Palm Coast, Florida, and my land is Piscataway and Timucua. And this is a reminder for us to show you how the world has really formed itself to create some of these inequities. And it's less about what we know, it's more about how we do our work and the importance of doing that work. And we must honor our values to and with each other at every level of our organization, communities, and within our families. And I want to channel Che Guevara for just a moment. At the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. We must strive every day so that this love of living humanity will be transformed into actual deeds, into acts that serve as examples and acts that serve as moving forces. And so today, I sit with a lot of heavy heart, thoughts, memories, and I'm seeing polarized views of what's actually happening that's shaping our identity today. And what I personally believe is that when we are able to have our hearts and our minds work in concert, we will no longer suffer from the obsession of conflict, the obsession specifically of racial conflict, that both values, both views, both sides of the aisles are indeed valid and that they have shaped who we are today. How might we sort of decrease this tension and increase more love for humanity? I believe that often just speaking of value is truly amazing. It gets the accountability marker out there. But what happens when families ask us, are we living our values? What happens when Black and Brown, Indigenous, people of color sort of stand side by side with you as the litmus to say that I have always been treated fairly. I have always been seen. I have always been valued. And sometimes valuing and seeing individuals for who they are, not just the one-sided story of what the world has told you about them, is tough. And it takes a little bit of tenacity and grit to really overcome how we were shaped and taught not to see things, not to recognize things, and also to be fully aware that the one filter that I can guarantee I make decisions out of is the filter of my worldview. So how might I be able to lead with the heart in an effort to reimagine what equity may even look like in our organizations, families, and community? So that takes me to what are we talking about anyway, right? So what is race? Often I ask individuals questions about race, and what we have come to realize is that race, as we know it, is a construct, right? So we recognize that race is not real; it's made up, and our designations has really characterized and changed over time. Some groups that are considered white in the U.S. today were non-white. In previous eras, as you can probably recognize, that Irish, Italian, and Jewish people became white. And this is an invention of whiteness, which I'll talk a little bit more about. The way in which we categorize one another are often reinforced, and they actually shape racism. See, the thing about race and racism is we also suffer from a nameless condition. No one, even, I hope this doesn't traumatize anybody, but even the incident with George Floyd, that officer for almost 10 minutes demonstrated self-righteousness. Some may call that hate. Some may call it racism. I'm not sure what it is, because the officer will probably never acknowledge that his acts were hateful, that his acts were indeed coming from a racial discriminatory perspective. We are making assumptions based on what the world has told us occurred that day. Black and brown people experience racism much differently than white people. And I say the nameless condition because when there's something that we can't name, therefore it means we cannot explore it. When there's something that is nameless, there means that we cannot interrogate it. When we live in a world and we have not named it, that means that we do not see the trauma that has been imposed and how that trauma impacts individuals. I challenge you to think about your systems and organizations for just a moment and realize that if we are indeed touting trauma informed, I dare us say that we are trauma informed when we're not race informed. Recognizing that we've made this social construct real, it's also a legal construct. And I put up a poll. I think it was put up a little bit too early. May I get that poll, the results of that poll back? There we are. So the question was, members of a race can be identified by their what? So I have 111 individuals say all of the above. So the answer is the 21%. So there's a small percentage of us who actually understand that race cannot be traced back to any of these: blood group, skin color, ancestry, genes. It's none of the above. And the reason why it's none of the above is because it's made up. I don't know how else to say that. I won't put a 50-cent word on it. It's just not real, good people. However, the reality of race has become so real in our country today. So it's less important for me as a member of the Black race, the Black culture, to think of race as a false construct, because Supreme Court has even written it into the census. We know that from the 60s until present, this is a census year, that we've gone from 4 races to about 5. We know that Latino and Hispanic culture, they don't identify as a race, but they can often fit into the white box. Once upon a time, we only had Caucasoid, Negroid, Oriental, and Indigenous as races. So how might we not be able to see that we have constructed through will, through power, something that has kept us tremendously divided? And that leads us to racism. Often when I ask a group of 300, 400 people to define racism, I may get back 200 different definitions, and maybe 1 or 2 in the room actually understand that racism is far more than just how we treat each other. Racism is in our soil. It's in our DNA. And again, we have not named it because when we do, we have to then deal with some of the, frankly put, some of the ugliness that comes from it. And what we often focus on are the symptoms of racism, not the causes of racism. Racism in it of itself is a system. There are 3 formulas here that I have put on the screen. I won't read them all, but I encourage you to really understand that racism is race prejudice, which is a lot different from discrimination, hatred, racial prejudice, and social and institutional power. Power is a conversation that is often hard to have. We know that power is relational. We can build power in this group of almost 400 individuals if we chose so. Through conversation, the conduit to building power is another human being. And also the conduit to actually maintaining power is to ascribe a certain level of power to others while disadvantaging individuals who we deem less worthy of holding that power. We'll talk a little bit later about our power bubble and how we might be able to expand that. Racism is a system of advantages based on that false construct of race that we have made real. Oppressive and traumatic experiences based on race. And race is a white supremacy system. And we're going to ask you a question in just a little bit about what white supremacy means and how it became sort of arise. When did it and how did it arise in our country? White privilege is another term that we often grapple with. Yes, we're talking about a conversation of race and resilience. All people have gone through adversity. All people are both beautiful and ugly. All people actually strive, work very hard, believe in merit, believe in hard work, determination, grit, the things that we teach our kids that actually help to build resilience. However, through the invention, evolution, and construction of race, we've gone from a period of time in the late 1600s where we were all shades of people, all walks of life, all diaspora. Before the invention of whiteness, we were all once upon a time, our ancestors, our families, our friends were all once upon a time indentured servants. And how might we think about the fact that we deconstructed the system and the structure of indentured servitude, but however we constructed the system, the peculiar system of slavery? White privilege is simply put refers to the unquestioned and unearned set of advantages, entitlements, and benefits and choices bestowed upon people solely because of what we have ascribed to whiteness. Generally, white people who experience such privilege do so without conscience. This is not an attempt for you to feel shame, guilt, or blame. We're moving into solution from causes to effects and how we might be able to band together and rethink what we've been taught about the world and others. Through the evolution of white privilege, we began to see this concept of otherness take form. This concept of otherness keeps us from telling the truth. We know that often we want to get to truth and reconciliation, truth and healing, truth and understanding. But those things are sequential. And what I mean by that is I'll channel Brian Stevenson for just a moment. He says that because of those things, they are sequential. How might we get to healing before we talk about the truth? And so what I mean is that there are some things that are deeply embedded in our systems and our structure that brings this concept of whiteness to light. And the reason why I share these definitions with you is to, one, hopefully have us on common ground. Two, quite intentionally, because Black and brown families that you work with, that you partner with, that are in your organization today, that live in your community, if there are some, they have been studied, examined, constantly tested and experimented on. I think we know exactly, we have enough data rather, to tell you the impacts of our racial construct, the impacts of our racial differences, and some may say the impacts of racism. We know exactly how much that has taken a toll on Black and brown community. So it's my opportunity in a nuanced conversation to really begin to say that if we are going to center, lead with hearts, minds, and humanity, and empathize with the experiences of Black, brown, and indigenous people of color, then we must also center, decenter whiteness and expose exactly what that means to us in our systems, in our DNA, and how we have been sort of consumed by and also perpetuate our omnipotence and power. The term white, referring to people, was only created by slave owners and colonial rule. They wanted to break away from the British rule. We established an identity of America. Our identity of America, if you really understand the history, our identity of America was a one-upsman. We wanted to be a little bit differently than British. We wanted to be different than the Europeans. Of course, we understand that they abolished slavery long before we did. That's true indeed. But we began to develop this caste system, the social hierarchies, where we had a few theories that were happening that helped to perpetuate the ideas, the myths about Black and brown individuals. The creation of whiteness meant giving privileges to some while denying them to others, with the justification of biological and social inferiority. We know that none of that's true today. It reminds me of what W.E.B. Du Bois says about this dual consciousness. I see myself in my fullness. I see myself in my full humanity. Hence the quote, "We're both ugly and beautiful at the same time." But somehow my ugliness is always magnified as an inferior wrong. When others make the same mistakes, they're not magnified at the same rate. Hence the largest gaps of racial disparities. So therefore, I'm seeing myself in one way, but yet the world tells me I'm something differently than who I feel I am internally. And it creates this dual consciousness, which then catapults Black and brown individuals to recognize their social conditioning and having to navigate a world consumed and filled by white dominant normative standards. This, again, is sometimes according to the world of Corey Best, but I want you to pose challenges, pose questions even, because I know whiteness well. I've been taught in white schools. I've been trained and taught by white teachers and professors. I know ground rules that adhere to sort of these standards of leaving emotions at the front door, that I am not to talk about certain things because those things were the past, that slavery was just a date-stamped experience and that it should have no impact on my mobility today. I know whiteness very well, and that will we'll pick up when we get to the conversations about power, because it's important to know that I too am indoctrinated in the same world that you're indoctrinated in. However, my experiences gives me an opportunity to see that oftentimes the world in which I am told to live, obey by, and be compliant in is not the same world that I want for my family, my child, my community, those families that I partner with. So I have a duality that I must sort of deal with in order to understand how I show up in a racialized world where many of us are taught to be blind, to just suck it up and get over it, to live through, to be resilient in spite of, and to understand at the same time that the playing field was never leveled from the very beginning. Yeah, I personally may not have witnessed a public lynching. I personally may not have seen my friends suffer at the hands of police brutality and actually lost life due to it. But I see that those that are similar to me reminds me of James Baldwin when he often says that because we suffer from a nameless condition, I cannot prove that the leaders of the union hate me. But all I know is that I do not see any leaders of the union that look like me. I cannot prove, nor do I care to say that the police overtly discriminate against me. But I tell you that I see how they treat those that look like me. I cannot prove that we are discriminatory and do not want Black and brown leaders in our organizations or institutions. But I do not see any Black and brown leaders in my organizations and institutions. So therefore, I must begin to ask myself the question, how did we get here? If the world says that all men are created equal, why is the world so imbalanced and so unequal? And so the bulk of the participants today are streaming in from Live Free or Die, the great state of New Hampshire. And I love New Hampshire. I mean, it was, I've visited twice. It was a nice respite. Great people, very nice. A nice little pancake place up there as I was headed north that I really enjoyed. But looking at the roots of New Hampshire, some say we don't have a problem with race in that particular state. When I've had intimate conversations with a few colleagues, we don't have a race problem in the state of Wisconsin, the state of New Hampshire, but we're almost 100% white. And I wonder if we've ever asked the question as to why. So through a quick scan of research, I realized that during colonization, New Hampshire enslaved just about over 200 people. There was a very famous runaway slave who was a servant for our first president and first lady. When you think about 1776 as our foundation, you see from the slide and through just a few bullets here that slavery continued up until 1796. There were actual blocks, auction blocks at the wharf in Studley's Tavern. For those of you who know the history of New Hampshire, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And most notably is the African burial ground that has been paved over that runs along Chestnut Street. When I look at the disparities, I look at the state being 94% white, 3% Latina, Latinx, 2% African American, 3% Asian. 2017, 8-year push, 8-year-old was pushed off a table uh, with a rope around their neck. 2018, someone in a leadership role was quoted, "Let's kill all the blacks." And when you look at the data of prison, because there is a narrative and a myth about black crime and how we criminalize black and brown families through a narrative of inferiority, which dates back to Reconstruction, even before. Where in Reconstruction, how do we think about power and economics, where in the South, legislators were actually indeed black individuals, but we took a freed man and made him a slave again, and that was through propaganda, narratives about their inability to function in such a powerful role, and also the South holding tight to its justification of needing to enslave, terrorize, and kill individuals for their skin color. So you see that 8% of the jail population are black when their population is 2%. That's almost 6 times higher. And then the prison population is almost 3 times higher in 2017 than the state population of people. So I ask you to walk away with traveling with these questions, and you ask yourselves, some may, why lead with race? Why are we continuing to have a conversation about race? Well, it's less about a conversation in 2020 about race. It's more of a conversation about what we misunderstand about race. I want you to see my color and also recognize what the world has asked you or told you about my color with that. And then you have added certain things to my skin tone. So it's less about my color and more about what you have added to my color that creates some of the profiling that we see. Through segregation, we still see environmental racism, transit racism, redlining, and child welfare practice. So in just a moment, I am going to put up another poll. But to answer the question about why do we lead with race, it addresses race explicitly, but not necessarily exclusively. And I'm going to get to the intersections for just one moment, because I know that this often, in these conversations, often confuse individuals. And I want to make sure I do everything I can within the time limit that I have to minimize any ambiguity. And we believe through World Trust and Race Forward that race explicit equity is the through line. We often get to the intersections of sexism, of misogyny, patriarchy, ableism, those intersections. However, there was a road paved before we can get to the intersection. So we believe that when we are race explicit and understanding the construct, we'll be able to get through the intersection and include race and poverty, race and ableism, race and sexual identity or orientation or expression. Those are the compounded impacts of race and also I can't speak 100% from a white-bodied experience or a white-bodied perspective, but I can tell you that after having countless conversations with groups of individuals, some conscious, some not so conscious, recognize that when we are not leading with hearts, mind, and humanity, we're not listening. And therefore, when we're not listening, we are advocating for our points of view, and self-interest really shows up in an amazing way, because it's more about what has happened to me. Look at me, I was poor, I'm disabled, I am not cisgen, I do not buy into the normative views, and I'm white. I have also experienced reverse discrimination or reverse racism. This is an opportunity, again, to magnify the traumas of Black and brown people, but also to expose whiteness. And I want to say that reverse racism is also a branded way of saying that your experiences are less important than mine. Those are the messages. So some things are coded language. Also, when it comes to the term of reverse racism, I am the first to tell you that Black and brown people, I won't speak for all, actually have prejudice, discrimination, bigotry, and even some may have hatred. That's a really strong emotion for me to say, because I've never felt that for another human being. But I'll tell you that even if all of the Black and brown people in America today stood up and said, we dislike white people, we will be prejudiced toward white people, that would do very little to your communities. That would do very little to how you mobilize. That would do very little to your political power today. That would do very little for your income. That would do very little for the outcomes that you have. So again, back to the definition of racism. Racism is much more than the individual, and we can move swiftly beyond the individual dimensions of racism. We can then see this from an institutional and a structural position and take a different vantage point to create new opportunities, as opposed to comparing traumas, because nothing happens when that occurs. I just want to say again that this is a systemic, these are systemic factors. One person alone did not create this structure. Some of us just chose to ride the waves of how it was constructed without questioning our indoctrination. And what I'm encouraging you to do today is to examine your hearts, minds, in order to see people in their full humanity, so you will better be equipped with asking and interrogating yourselves. And so there are some things that churn the system of inequities. I've given you a really abridged version of some historical context, some definitions. Let's just imagine we all have some common language. We know the hymn book that we're singing from, and that is our history. So when you look at this infinity circle, one of the conversations that we rarely have is that the system of inequities are churned by us, whether our complicity, our silence. And I'll just speak for myself. May 25th to present, I really had to go through a lot of long suffering, as my grandmother would say, based on where my finances are attached. I was asked to look at my email and prioritize equity and justice. Well, actually, my mentor asked me if I prioritize equity and justice. And of course, I said, yeah, don't you know who I am? I'm Corey Best. I'm Black. I'm a social justice advocate. Damn right, I prioritize equity and justice. I'm all about parents' equality and good enough parenting and systems change. Yes, I prioritize equity and justice. Well, he said to me, Corey, like I would tell any other person, your proximity to Blackness is that you're Black, but your being Black does not make you automatically prioritize justice and equity. And so when I looked at my email, I saw that I did not. I prioritized where my earnings came from. And many of these systems, I won't name names, many of these systems do not prioritize equity. They will call on me for other things. They will call on me to advance an outcome for their goals. They will call on me to help their institution change, not for families, and definitely not with Black and brown families. And that was a really, really hard look. And serendipitously, I'm here. I've learned what hill I will die on, and I have said more no's in the past 9 months than I've said yes, because I want to leave a legacy for my son. I want to be able to say my final breath that I lived for something, that I lived for humanity, that I lived not for to beg people for charity, because Black and brown people don't want charity. What we have often missed is validation. What we have often missed is acknowledgement that there's a problem. And that's why I say the nameless condition, the need for definitions, the need to understand our history and how that history has shaped our culture. Because overwhelmingly, we've seen since May 25th, organizations write letters and statements and telling the world what they should do to advance equity and justice and what they need to learn. There's been so many books sold, written, and Zoom meetings about race and equity and privilege and anti-racism, but yet and still globally, where's the acknowledgement that there's a problem? So we haven't looked at the problem through the same lens, and therefore we will continue to churn the systems of inequities until we do. And it doesn't mean that your heart has to believe what I believe. It means that you have to look at individuals as human beings and critically examine yourself enough to think for yourself with your own mind. And if you have no one in your circle, no one in your village that is challenging you to think differently, I encourage you to make that your number one priority. Because what happens in the internal is invisible. These biases, these privileges, the way that we internalize racism from Black body perspective, the way that white people internalize superiority, we know intellectually, we know that superiority and inferiority do not coexist. However, our culture was shaped by our racial terror, shaped by a myth that race is real, and also use science, Christianity to justify the reality of the need for subjugation, marginalization, and also segregation. And these things actually show up in our interpersonal behaviors with one another, whether we're stifled, whether we have no idea what to do, what to say. It shows up in our interpersonal relationships with one another. As a Black man, I care less that you make mistakes. I care more that you say something. But our biases, our privileges, and our internalized racism shows up in how we write policy. It shows up in how our structures are designed, and all of that creates our identity. And so I want to ask you to look for just a moment. Just look at the American dream game. Just let that settle for just a moment. Here we have at the end a cloud from a white gentleman asking this obviously Black young man, are you just slow or what? And so I want to dig and unpack a little bit about social or cultural orientation, resiliency that comes with this, and the tenacity and grit to be able to navigate a world in which, again, you see yourself one way, and the world sees you in another light. And what begins to happen is we forget trauma. Racial oppression is trauma. And so when you think about the occurrences that have been able to globally establish wealth, status, and power to one group and not the other, by mere nature of race, we see from Jim Crow laws to denial of voting and also voting tax. We live through an era of civil rights. We see that poor neighborhoods and schools, you lose turns when you develop self-depreciating beliefs and attitudes and want to feel a sense of belonging through gang culture. right? We see that affirmative action was not so affirmative for Black people because it's like, oh, you will get the job just because you're Black. Ain't true, good people. And also we see that we have turned the peculiar system of slavery into a prison pipeline. When you look at the data from 1861, as the Civil War began to commence, which we were not taught about in school. We knew about Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, but we didn't know too much about cotton, slavery, power, economics, and how we intentionally segregated marginalized individuals. But the prison population in 1861 was about 80% non-Black individuals, non-Indigenous individuals. And then in 1866, a year after the Civil War, by 1868, I'll say, 3 years after the Civil War, that population of inmates flipped. And what we saw was about a 90% increase of Black individuals who were incarcerated. And we know why that was, because we utilized the structure and institution of slavery and incarceration to create what we call convict leasing. So these individuals who were just arrested for minor crimes, let's imagine you're now free. We have Emancipation Proclamation, right? Lincoln freed the slaves. We're all free. And then we are walking with no land, no property, no 40 acres and a mule, and we get arrested for trespassing. Well, in today's society, you either get a citation or a ticket for that, right? Just depending upon where you are. But what that would get Black individuals, particularly Black men in 1868, that would get them leased out as property back into the plantation. And so I mention these things because I want us not to think about how slow Black and brown communities are, but also think about how resilient, how strong they are in the face of all of these structural occurrences. Remember, none of you on the phone owned slaves. None of you picketed or rioted or voted for segregation laws. None of you created the courts. None of you created redlining. None of you created this movement called the civil rights. Antecedents have done that. We walk in the legacy of our ancestors, whether white or Black. And therefore, this shows you a structure of inequities that is based on age-old fallacy that race is real and that one race is more superior than the other. And it creates major wealth gaps. You know, just before the call, just before our time today, we were talking about parents struggling and how Pat's a grandma and like grandma to the rescue, right, to help with school. Many of our families do not have the technology not to send their kids to brick and mortar. Many families, many Black and brown families have to work. And when we think about the impact that COVID has had on Black and brown communities, we also must factor in what were the pre-existing conditions in that community? What are the environmental contexts in that community? And are individuals living in multi-generational homes? Are individuals living in communities where they don't have access to things? Did those individuals create those communities for themselves? I have not met any one person of any race, ethnicity, nationality want to be where they are. Even if they're affluent, we still want more. So there was a study in the 1996 that asked over 600 white people what they felt about quote unquote welfare. And they said that 57% of those surveyed out of 600 believed that Black families want to live on welfare. While when they asked the question of white families, only 4% of the 600 indicated that white families chose and wanted to live on welfare. We have a division that begins with our hearts and our minds, and these ideas about individual racialized groups have been given to us by our structures and our institutions. And until, again, we can question why, we may not be able to bring our hearts, minds, and humanity into concert with one another. And so we've heard a lot about structural racism over the course of our lives, but we haven't really become familiar with how that looks. And I'm going to back up for just a moment. I did have another survey. Will you please post that? And so here's the question: which is not an example of a government racial preference program? And I'll give you a moment to answer that question. Which is not an example of a government racial preference program? And while you're doing that, I'm just going to eyeball the chat really quickly. So I'll allow us to really channel what's been said. And I'm going to do a little perusing here, utilizing the virtual platform. Okay. Good to see. I'm going to close this, and when the results come, we can just pop them up. Don't be afraid to cut me off at all, Karen. I want to get through culture, racialized. There we are. Well, let's see what we have here. So, which is not an example of a government racial preference program. So we have, it's flipped. So we have 21%. Well, actually, it's about the same. 21% of you are like racial scholars, right? So the answer is the Civil Rights Act. So when we think about, let me give a little explanation here. So 1790 Naturalization Act, you know, that just said that someone was basically a human being, right? That allowed for free white people to adopt citizenship. The Civil Rights Act made racial discrimination in public places illegal. And I'll pause there for a moment to get to this culture piece that you see in the iceberg. Civil Rights Act made racial discrimination in public places illegal. What does that tell you when you hear that? This is not a racial preference program, right? But it also tells you that we needed a piece of legislation to tell white Americans that Black people should be able to go into dwellings and eat, purchase, work, learn at the same rate as white people. The Civil Rights Act did not tell Black people that they were equal or that they were human. We've always known that. We've needed a piece of legislation to tell Americans, the masses of Americans, that we are equal. The other programs are all examples of racial preferences for white people. Over a 40-year period, the Homestead Act gave away for free 270 million acres of land, formerly Indian territory, which is why I did the land acknowledgement, almost all to white people. So that's 270 million acres of land that we got to build on, stolen land. The Naturalization Act allowed for free white people to adopt citizenship, thus opening voting rights and property ownership to European immigrants, but barring Asians and other groups from that property ownership. Racial barriers to citizenship were not removed until 1952. The Federal Housing Administration has made it possible for millions of millions of average white Americans, but not others, to own homes for the first time. So, and the Social Security Act specifically exempted 2 occupations from coverage. And you all want to know what those 2 occupations that were exempted from the Social Security Act? There's just 2 minor exemptions to show you how the institutional and structural dimension are the policies that are written through our biases, privileges, and superiority. And those 2 from coverage were farm workers, go figure, right? Farm workers and domestics. And so what that says is that we know that because we deconstructed indentured servitude, not to say that white people were not farm workers. If white people were farm workers, they were exempt at that moment, but they were not the highest population of farm workers. If white people were domestics at that time, yes, by law, they were exempted. So of course, some were sacrificed. This is again about privileges, not about who didn't suffer, right? So the institutional piece is that when we understand how wealth was distributed, we begin to see the everyday normalization of these things of racism that happened. One I will say that are ahistorical. But when you think about farm workers and domestics for a moment, and you think about 1919, let's say up until 1952, we know that many, just like with the impact of COVID, many Black and brown individuals work in the helping industry, work in food industry, bus drivers, caregivers, frontline workers. The way of earning money for Black people were to work on the farms, because we didn't have a law that say you can come into legally a brick and mortar until 1964. So if the Social Security Act exempted 2 occupations that are valuable, how would people earn Social Security? So our racial ideology, popular ideas and myths that perpetuate these hierarchies. So what we've done, if you haven't witnessed, is we've scaffolded sort of this caste system and social hierarchies based on racial difference, based on the myth of whiteness, based on how we deem Black and brown people to be inferior. And these policies which I just sort of outlined, going from the Civil Rights Act to the 1935 Social Security Act, are interconnected, right? So we have a compounding relationship and rules that reinforce these inequities. So give you an instance, in today's world, I'm sure that there are some in child welfare and also maybe even in early learning on the call today. So when you think about here in the state of Florida, we have early learning coalitions that provide subsidy to families for childcare. There's always priority funding for child protection families, because we know that if there's an allegation of maltreatment, that's high likelihood that a child is going to be removed and placed into foster care. So what we've seen is that we have a population of children that are Black, brown, and indigenous, Latinx included, that are being removed from their homes. We, in early learning environments who provide subsidy, we have institutional policies that allow us not to question child protection, because that is the funding that's attached to our institution. So therefore, we are interconnected with the way child welfare policy works, and also our internal institutional policy that keeps us in this bind. And it also is quite invisible if we're not really interrogating it, which leads to, why are 65% of Black and brown kids coming into care? Is it that Black and brown families abuse their children at a higher rate than white families? Absolutely not. I'll leave that question with you to sort of unpack and challenge one another to think about the large gaps and inequities. Same thing with education. Education is interconnected with child welfare policy, early learning, and also the Department of Juvenile Justice. So when we think about interconnected institution and policies, think about how that comes from history, our roots and cumulative impact of white domination in the United States. And of course, as we begin from a white-bodied experience, looking at the census, as we begin to invite other ethnicities, immigrants into the Caucasoid box, way back in this late 16 to 1700s, we were doing that intentionally for power and privilege and dominance. And so some of the foundations of our hierarchical power is colonialism, right? So we have native genocide that we've talked a lot about, and we also have slavery, capitalism, and patriarchy. I will say that from my education, my mentorship, my reading, and my experiences, that slavery, capitalism, and patriarchy are the conjoined triplets. So we know that our system, America was formed through white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men, right? Predominantly men, white men who legislated, advanced, sort of cultivated this peculiar system of slavery for capitalistic gains. We know that exotification and war and militarism is also a foundation of our hierarchy. And that brings me to a narrative. And this narrative is one that I feel we're up against. And this is a narrative that we must sort of begin to chip away at and understand if this narrative from the 1800s, 1862 to be exactly, is something that is familiar, at least in our child and family serving systems and child protection specifically. And I'll read this. The institution of slavery per se is as justifiable as the relationship of husband and wife, parent and child, or any other civil institution of the state. It is most necessary to the well-being of the Negro, being the only form of government or pupillage which can raise him from barbarism or make him useful to himself or others. And I have no doubt but that the institution thus far in our country has resulted in the happiness and elevation of both races. That is, the Negro and the white man. In no period of the world's history have 3 million of the Negro race been so elevated in the scale of being, or so much civilized or Christianized as those in the United States as slaves. They are better clothed, better fed, better housed, and more cared for in sickness and in health than has ever fallen to the lot of any similar number of the Negro race in any age or nation. And as a Christian people, I want you to pay attention to this last sentence. And as a Christian people, I feel that it is the duty of the South to keep them in their present position at any cost and at every peril, even independently of the questions of interest and security. I think about interest as my heart, my mind, and how I'm seeing humanity. In child welfare, we use a term, the best interest of the child. We utilize a hotline, a child abuse call-in number that is chock full of racial biases. And we place a call and say, Johnny has come to school 3 days in a row with dirty socks in November and a short sleeve shirt on in New Hampshire. And the teacher has not reached out at all to mom or have provided Johnny with a pair of socks. What we call an institution, we call a system to come in and do what for Johnny in Johnny's family. We feel often, this is a narrative that we're up against and we must confront it because the data tells the story. We feel often that it's better for Black and brown Native American children to be placed in more affluent, whiter, smarter families. But what we know about hearts, minds, humanity, and child development is that a child needs to be with his family, with his own. And if we could, at our highest form of enlightenment, love individuals in the way that we love our own, we may not be in the pickle that we're in. So a mental health clinician told me a long time ago, because I have a son who's 11 and my son has a brother. And if any of you have been through Protective Factors, you've heard me talk about Caden and Corbin. And so Corbin is my biological son and Caden is my son. And I love him as such. He doesn't live with me, but I care for him. I dream about him. I wish him well. I cry for him. I teach him. I discipline him. And this clinician, infant mental health clinician, says that, you know, I don't know too many people that truly, truly love another person's child as if they're their own. It takes something uniquely special in an individual, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but it dawned on me that as we put children in foster care, especially Black children with white families who have not been given the consciousness, the level of understanding, and also who realize that they live with bias. So it's not about me saying Black families, Black children should not be with white families. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I'm asking us as a system to recognize that there's some knowledge that we need. There's some understanding that we need. There's some culture that shapes who we are. And most of that is trauma. And when I say trauma, I'm not talking adverse childhood experiences. I'm talking about trauma of how we're socialized, trauma of age-old oppression. And in order to embrace beautiful Black families, beautiful brown families, beautiful indigenous families, we must also have the heart and minds to do so. And often we actualize ourselves much differently than the world sees us. But we've read stories about individuals who wish that mom or dad who are white would have just told me about my racial makeup and how the world sees me. We can teach our children in the home if we choose to be colorblind. We can teach them to love everyone equally. We can teach them that to embrace the world with open arms. But we also have to teach them from white body and Black body experiences that the world may also see you in a way. And so we know that through study, through research, that it's virtually impossible for anyone to be colorblind. And the reason why I say I want you to see my color earlier is because I want you to see my color and also challenge yourself with what you're attaching to it. And if there's even a thread of Corey being exceptional today, I want you to smash that. Because I am not an exception. I am an extension of George Floyd. I am an extension of Ahmaud Arbery. I am an extension of Jacob Blake. They are me and I am them. And let's not forget that. I see myself every single time I read another article. I see an extension of myself dying. I see an extension of myself having to pull myself up again. I see an extension of myself being traumatized over and over again. And the world asks me to stand up and do it more. And I'll tell you, oftentimes my resilience gets shattered because I don't feel that it's always my place to teach the rapist how not to rape. I think it's time for us to really examine ourselves individually and begin to recognize if this narrative that I show you here is even remotely close to how we practice in our systems. And so, a traveling question from everything that we've gone through this first portion, I'll ask you to just think about and travel with. Everything is not supposed to be unpacked in a moment. Phases of equity practice, which I'll get to after the break, will show you that there's a culture of not knowing that we want to embrace. Because one thing that I've learned in this particular conversation about race equity, anti-racism, justice, social equality, however we're terming it, is that when we've been given a set of normative values and views, oftentimes we need the answer. Many of our tools do not work in this conversation of equity and racism and anti-racism because there's often a need for us to diminish our obligation for understanding and also exact this need for empirical data. You know, I was in a conversation and I talked about a few events of my life with what I thought was a trusted friend, and even a trusted friend in white body says to me, I don't believe that those things happened. And he also said that, how can you prove that that's racist? So it shows me, again, proximity to Blackness. And this is a friend of mine still to this day. We, of course, had a nice hearty conversation after that. I won't get into the details of it. But that was the importance of me being able to, one, validate his experiences, and also him being able to be open enough, willing enough to listen to my perspective. Not that it changed anything in his systems, but it changed a little bit in his heart because he took the opportunity to recognize and see that some of his thinking in systems is replicated based on our historical events. And that leads me to sharing and understanding power, and how might we begin to share, construct, and deconstruct power with our families, with our people in our neighborhoods, you know, in the malls whenever we get a chance to go back into them, in the grocery stores, right? Whenever we stop using the delivery services for convenience. But when we are again able to interact with people and have healthy dialogue, remembering that the first virtual reality was actually having a conversation with a person, right? And so that is always your way in to another person's heart. But when we think about families and we think about those that we are obligated or have taken an oath to serve, let's think about what it means to share power. And while you'll just digest that particular slide, I am going to scroll again some of the chat, and I will promise you I will not get into anything about Candace Owens. Okay. So we have, so there were a few questions and comments there, and I know my team behind the curtain will give me a heads up. We're going to sort of speed up a little bit for a break. I think we have a break in, if I am correct, we have a break. If you can give me 2 minutes, I will get you out of here. So I just want to touch on here, race is about power. Remember, power is an inherent human characteristics, nothing biologically sound about it. And just a few definitions of power. So ability to act, ability to do, power position, economic power, power over, power with. When we come back from break, we're going to stop it here and we're going to bulldoze through how we begin to share power with our families. And I appreciate everybody's time, energy, and commitment to this first part of our scheduled event.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Rourke. I'm the director of New Hampshire Tomorrow at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. We're proud to sponsor today's event. We want to thank you all for participating in this very important conversation. Our New Hampshire Tomorrow project is focused on making sure that kids and families who are furthest from opportunity have access to education, healthcare, and career pathways to ensure that every family thrives. We know in New Hampshire, now more than ever, it's not the case for everybody. We're really honored to continue to support so many nonprofits and community leaders that are working to confront racial, social, and economic injustice. We stand as a partner, and we're happy to be in the fight with you. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the day.
The Children's Trust's key important role is to support family resource centers. We do it through training, we do it through programming so that parents have access to information, to education, to resources. I know in raising my children, community was a huge part of it. It was how everybody acted collectively, how everybody watched all of our children collectively, how everyone exhibited how to care for our children. Supported families are strong families, no matter where they live or what they look like.
When we support our families, we're supporting our communities, and we support our communities, we're supporting our state. And when we support that, everybody is going to benefit, whether they have children or not.
If you had told me when I was 50 I would be bringing up a year-old child, I would have thought, I can't do that. There was puzzles, and there was those toys that make noises that you ride on, and oh my God, doll houses and doll tents. What was preceding all that is the trauma of having a grown son who was in the throes of addiction. We were in the dark. I had no idea how to go about the legalities of guardianship. I just marched myself into the courtroom carrying this infant baby. I said, I need guardianship of my granddaughter. We felt like an island. Nobody needs to do this alone.
Welcome back. I'll leave a few moments here for a little reflection before we jump into the latter part of our time today. I see some familiar faces. Hey, Larry, I'm so Glad to see your vulnerability in the space today. There are a few questions or comments. One, I want to get right at Dana's first, and want to know if Dana would like an invitation to speak live, and maybe we can engage in a verbal conversation. If not, I'll go ahead and answer the question. So Dana's comment was, don't we all experience the idea that we're seen differently than the way we feel? Not saying it's okay, but there's a natural tendency to categorize and you understand, miscategorize our way that we look at one another. So the quick answer, Dana, is I'm sure that we all experience the idea that we are seen differently. And when it comes to the conversation of race, I would encourage us all to think about racial difference, and not that the difference is the bad thing, right? So we have added negative connotations, tones, myths, and narratives about non-white individuals that are inherently or historically negative. And what we've done for non-Black Indigenous people of color, as we've ascribed a level of sort of quote unquote white is white, white is right. I mean, you can see these in the books that we read. You can see this in how we're even taught in school about our history. You can see that white is always known as good and Black is always known as bad. You can understand this when you look at studies from Miss Pittman, even when she does the blue eye sort of division in her workshops. You can see this from the inherent implicit bias test through Harvard. You can see that we have an affinity actually to lighter skinned individuals. And this is even from a Black person's experience, right? So I'm a light skinned Black person, and I am fully aware. I'm fully aware of even the colorism that exists in Black and brown communities. I'm fully aware that I have light skin privileges. And no, it does not make me feel good to know that my darker skinned brothers and sisters have experienced a level of discrimination based on what the world has told us about who is more positive, who is more superior, who is more likely to achieve. And I'll cap it off by saying that some of this categorizing individuals, not some, all, is purposeful. So when you look at historically Black and brown Black colleges and universities, for just an example, right? When you look at those institutions historically for fraternities and sororities, you'll see that alpha, like if you pledge, AKA if you pledge alpha for just an example, those are more light-skinned individuals. When you get down to the omegas, right, you start to see that those are more darker individuals. Well, historically speaking, you'll notice that you'll hear that there were paper bag tests for those schools. So the paper bag was, if you were darker than a brown paper bag, then you were divided based on skin tone. And this came from our our hierarchical structures that we talked about earlier. Dana, did you want to add a few more things there? I see you're willing to be unmuted.
Well, I just wanted to say that I sometimes feel shameful that because I'm white and I also happen to grow up in a privileged environment, but yet at the same time I experienced a lot of trauma and pain in my life, like everybody, but yet people discounted my situation because I had everything that anybody would want, including my white skin. So, and I don't mean to question the pain that all of this racism has happened, in this country over the years, over history. I'm not questioning that at all. I just am trying to make sense of how to take it without, let's see, sorry, how to take it without minimizing just the basic humanity of trauma. I mean, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I understand, and I wish we had much more time to talk. And what I would encourage you to think about is the accumulated advantages and disadvantages. Uh, we can't live in a hypothetical world, but if we were able to for just a moment, let's just remove the notion of racism and race and replace it with trauma. That means that all of our systems and individuals would be attended to based on how they have been treated equitably due to experiences in their lives. Some of the trauma that we see as symptoms of a racial hierarchical structure are actually things that we feel from a dominant perspective are self-imposed by Black people. So as you're eloquently sort of illustrating, Dana, that when you've experienced a level of trauma, that brings a level of also shame. I'm gonna bring shame into the conversation with when things happen to us as kids, as adults. We often don't want to talk about it because sometimes, depending upon the trauma, we may internalize that as if it's something that we did. When you think about trauma and you think about rage stems from something that has happened to a person. And when individuals in Black and Brown communities and families have their trauma dismissed, dehumanized, and not validated, what we're attempting to do is suppress it, right? And when we suppress trauma, what ultimately happens is we feel we have no voice, right? So we're left to be voiceless. And what I would encourage anyone who's working with Black and Brown families and thinking about racism as trauma, to begin with equipping them with voice lessons, to be able to speak to the pain, to the trauma. And I didn't take it as if you were attempting to minimize the trauma, but when you view it from who has experienced accumulated disadvantages. So even if the trauma is not physical, the trauma is environmental. The trauma is how teachers are treating you. The trauma is how the police are treating people who look like you in your community. The trauma is what you see right now on social media and in all news reports. The trauma is also not being seen, heard, and valued for your full humanity, understanding that we've all experienced hardship that has made us resilient to this point. But some of the hardship comes from a myth. And that myth is the myth of racial difference. So some of the trauma that we're talking about, Dana, is trauma that has been legalized trauma, right? Institutionalized trauma. When we talk about childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences, none of those ACEs are legalized and institutionalized, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, I'm 100%, I love your answer. This institutionalized racism, that's really the key answer to my comments. So I thank you for that.
Absolutely. I will, I appreciate you asking. This Candace Owens questions keep popping up in my face here. I said I wouldn't answer it, and I don't necessarily have an answer, especially for the time today, but what I will encourage, who asked that question? What I will encourage you to do, Chase, is to understand the power of dominant perspective and the power of whiteness. And so Candace Owens and so many others, and this is not a knock against them, have internalized racism in a different way, right? So many of us believe that there are things that are innately wrong with Black and brown communities, and that American dream game that I told you does not impact our mobility today. I believe that we have data that tells us a different story. So I'll leave that there, and I will get one more. So let's see. There was one about solutions, and I believe that that's where we're gonna go. We're gonna head to solutions. Alicia, would you like to come off of mute and have your question acknowledged? And then this will be the last one, and we'll roll through for 20 minutes. So equal or equitable, she begins. You said that these are constructs. Now, since these constructs created disparities in programs and interventions, identified differences targeted and lift, it also continues the construct. How do we both support acknowledgement and yet not continue to deepen the construct? Alicia, would you like to elaborate a little more?
Yes, at the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about how genes and skin color and all of those are really just constructs. So with that in mind, trying to, as you said, keep everyone feeling equitable and equal and having one community. And at the same time, knowing that there's, as you said, this history of trauma that through generations, and even in the current day, that's created discrepancies like you mentioned about people in prison and in jail, and even health disparities and socioeconomic disparities. How do we target and lift that in those aspects without deepening the idea that these people are different?
Oh, so basically, how do we achieve something different without pathologizing behavior?
Yes.
That's a common question. So one, I'll tell you that I like to frame the answer for that question in 3 buckets. So we have helpers, we have jailers, and we have healers, right? So at the beginning of our time, I said that it's more important about what's most important is the way in which we do our work. So one, from an individual perspective as a helper, sometimes a helper is a person who just picks up the pieces, but a helper is also one that maintains sort of this level of neutrality, right? Like some of that's true, some of it's not. What I'll say about equality and equity, I think that if we believe in equality, we're living a dream that may not become reality. For me as a Black person, Alicia, equality won't happen. I'm not expecting equality. I know that there are some people who will always be more educated than me that should always earn more money than me because they put in more work than me, right? But I also recognize that it is not about equality, nor completely about the inequities. What troubles me and many others is the gaps of inequities, right? So these are huge gaps. It's not just that everyone had an opportunity to make $75,000 and one person squandered it and the other really held on to it. But it's about these huge gaps and these systemic things. So we begin to think about the notion of save and rescue or supporting, right? So if you as an institution or an individual believe that these things are pathologically, innately in Black community, then I would encourage you to think about why you feel that these are inherent problems. The second is the jailer, right? So we have a jailer who will constantly pathologize these behaviors and tell the world that I am treating this group of individuals based on their inability to do what the institution says they should do or to be compliant or what have you. The jailer is someone that is, quote unquote, just doing my job, right? We've all met those people, just doing my job, and unintentionally, those are the connecting threads of pathologizing behavior and also supplanting some of these antiquated thoughts into our institutional policies. The healers are you. And how we get at the root of healing is to challenge on an individual basis these assumptions about pathology. And that starts with you. That starts with how you look at the policies. And also a healer is someone who sees the process and also sees the hope in individuals. And this is hope in systems that they will also be able to change, and also hope in the journey. And what I'll say about pathology and racial trauma, Alicia, is it's a lot different than any other trauma, right? And so what I mean is, it's rare that we'll be able to pathologize Black and Brown communities as it's their self-made prophecy or their self-fulfilled prophecy that they're in certain situations. Because when we look at trauma, that means we have to trace the source. So where there is inequities, where there is trauma-induced inequities, that means that as a system, we can begin to deconstruct it when we look at the source of said trauma. And I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Yes, I do appreciate that. And it sounds as though instead of looking at the current situation and exactly the disparity, looking at where this disparity came from to try to rectify that and addressing that. Am I hearing that correctly?
You are hearing that correctly. So we often, again, I have a dear friend, and I'll move us forward after this. I have a dear friend who says that Black and Brown people are the most studied, but the least understood. White Americans are the least studied, but the most understood. And I just leave that with you.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Baseline of normalcy. So I hope you're all strapped in. We've gone through a little bit of common language. We've level set just a bit. We've had an opportunity to engage in some short, hopefully meaningful dialogue with your colleagues and attendees here. We are now moving into calls to solution and getting at the power. And so when I think about power and power being relational, I think about what we do often in our systems, right? So I'll start with thinking about who is normal. When you think about a normal person, when you think about a normal individual, recognizing race is about power. Power has various dimensions, and we want to move is from power to or power over to power with. It's specifically our families and our Black and Brown community members and leaders. So when you think about normal, what image comes to mind? And when I first was asked this question, you fight what comes first, and what comes first is normal for me is white. White is normal. Based on, again, my experiences, and quite frankly, maybe based on your experiences as well. Able-bodied is normal. I don't have to think about, the Americans with disabilities. I don't have to think about that. Cisgen, the world has told us for years that this marriage equality and how people express themselves, and that cisgen patriarchy is just the way to go. Christianity is also something that pops to mind when I think about normal and also educated. And as we look at that image there, that is creating a bubble of power. That bubble of power is often, you can shift those words around and you can put executive director, you can put assistant there, you can put your director of programs, you can put your funder, all in those boxes, and that's who gets to make power and who gets to tell the story. Many of us, including myself at times, are in that bubble of normalcy. And that's a baseline for normalcy that gives us an opportunity to really forget that there are some people out there that are screaming, I see you, and the way you see yourselves is not how I'm experiencing your systems. So how might we begin to look at marginalized groups of people and expand our bubble of power? And how we do that is radical inclusion. So many of us have gone through the beautiful DEI trainings, right? We have diversity, we have equity, we have inclusion. Some things are appearances and others are intentional. So in the conversation of race, racism, anti-racism, equity, inclusion, diversity, we often make that one jumbled up, convoluted conversation, when actually we're talking about 5 to 6 different things. And so they should be separate conversations, because as we look at race as the through line will get us into how we might be able to look at the margins and move the margins inward, so the people that are, so that all are actually closer to the center of power. And as people get closer to the center of power, we begin to create new power. And that power enlarges the center of our. I'm hearing some noise here, and it was a little distracting. My apologies there. Restructures power so that all can fully participate. And so how we begin to get there is, if you give me 1 second, I do apologize, but I have a technician here, and I just need to tap on my window and just let him know that this is not a really good time for the drilling. Just 1 second here.
We cannot hear you.
You can't hear me?
I can hear you.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. So how we get to sharing power is building on our strengths. Our strengths are, what's my outlook? What's my belief? What do I think about Black and brown individuals? What am I understanding about racism? Who do I need to have in my corner in order to really involve, not just through tokenism, but really have individuals' experiences involved in my processes? And the challenges are often similar to, in this conversation, our strengths. So we have to understand that we mustn't allow perfection to be the enemy of good, right? Or progress. And then we create goals. So this is sort of a formula that I'll unpack for you as you begin and to shift power for racial justice. So you identify a goal. We'll go through a power analysis, and I'll give a few questions about what that power analysis look like. You will have to weigh your options, select a new course of action. Remember, this is equity, justice, racial justice is something that we haven't seen yet in our country. That does not or should not give us an opportunity to live in despair, because we realize that despair and hopelessness, and hope does not coexist. So we select a new course of action and determine our next steps. This will begin the process of really advancing justice. So we have I'll give you just an example of institutional decision-making. Within that that bubble of power, or that baseline of normalcy. We have centralized and decentralized. I will not read the examples here just for time, but just understand that centralized is usually just one place. And so I'll go back to the image here. As you can see, centralized decision makings often are within that baseline of normalcy. And then we have decentralized, where everyone's voices are heard and actually incorporated into decisions. An example of a power analysis is, the first question is always the one: who currently holds power? Understanding proximity to power, what we ascribe to power, and also how we begin to internalize power. And I giggle a little bit because I was on a call with a few CEOs last week, and I asked them this first question. And then the second question was, can you tell us a time that you felt apart or not from a group? And many of them acknowledged that they have never felt that they weren't a part of a group, meaning a racial group, because their whiteness travels. But they did feel disappeared from influences of power, right? So many of them have also achieved a certain status within the community, and they acknowledge the fact that as they gain power, they often abused power. And this abuse of power is not intentional. It just comes with sort of this territory of, one, we have been attempting to esteem or achieve this level of standard. So when you think about whiteness being the standard, you think about what individuals are attempting to sort of achieve. Even as we were inventing, the world was inventing whiteness, you can see sort of discrimination even within white race. And what I mean is, once upon a time, we believed that the whiter you were, the more blue eye you had, the more blonder you were, the more Nordic, Scandinavian you were, the whiter you were. And those individuals in the late 1600s were also considered the upper class. So who are you in relationship with, right? So I would encourage us to begin to think about a few things here. I won't go through each and every one, but one, who's being burdened or harmed? And this goes to Alicia's point here. Who's being burdened or harmed? What are we trying to transform? Are we trying to create more barriers, services for parents, or are we actually trying to transform something? The secondary questions, as you begin to develop new courses of action, I like to call them, based on your strengths, goals, and challenges. What will power look like when you're all done deconstructing, shifting, and constructing power, right? And what types of power are you trying to manifest? And again, this goes back to our earlier slide of power with, power to, and power within individuals. And that takes us to sort of developing this resilient organization, right? So there are some phases to anti-racist thinking. It starts at the individual level, but it also elevates itself into institutional practice. And these phases are sort of given to us by Dr. Daryl Wing Su, and he does a lot of work on aggressions. I have stopped saying microaggressions. I believe that anything that is aggressive cannot be micro. So it really doesn't make too much sense to me to say microaggressions, but he does a lot of work with understanding race talk and the dynamics of, and there's a body of research that shows educators how we all show up in this work. But the first phase is our naivety. So we have to get over the naive thinking that we have in order to be able to conform to new thinking, utilizing what's in our hearts and in our minds. That conformity will often get us into this level of dissonance, right? So this dissonance, we can't really rationalize what's happening based on my worldview, and it's creating a disconnect. And as I'm disconnected, I'm attempting to go stages 1, 2, 3 back and forth. That becomes sort of the norm. Naivety, conformity. I'm engaging in a Zoom today with Corey. I'm going to sit on a nice little social group later this evening with some white friends, or I'm going to have a Black caucus if we're people of color on the call with my girlfriends or my classmates from college and talk about how we're seeing racism. Those things will get you over naivety, but just think about a few things that has happened since May 25th to September 8th. Between May and July, all of you on the call probably read more, talked more, did more. Right now, school's starting, your problems are starting to take over, life's happening again. You are slowly withdrawing from the conversation of race if you're a white person because you can, because you do not have to see it, because you are not deeply impacted by racism in the way that Black people are. But I will say you are being deeply impacted by racism. It's just not the same way. You're constantly bombarded with this dissonance, and it's creating this sort of tension in your being. So the resistance and the immersion really start to begin when you recognize that once upon a time you had a default button. That default button is getting a little larger. You have an opportunity to withdraw, or you can immerse yourself into deeper conversation. You can challenge yourself through compare with your heart and your mind. You can talk to other people. You can use the original way of virtually connecting to someone and have conversation. When you reach resistance, individually, interpersonally, and also institutionally, the tip I have here is think about resisting the urge to resist learning. This resistance and immersion phase here is the pivotal point. This is where you realize there's a breakthrough and, hey, am I trying to teach other people how not to think like I did before? Don't worry about teaching other people so much. That takes the onus away from you. In this work, the goal is to continuously grind and churn new thinking for yourself. Cornel West says it best. He says, I teach Harvard students, and the one thing that Harvard students always say is that they were always the smartest person in class. He says, well, you know what? I don't want you to be smart. I want the phones to be smart and you to be wise. I am here to help you peel back several layers in order for you to consciously, critically think for yourself. Resistance and immersion is not to be swayed by the world, but to be determined by your heart. Introspection will give you that opportunity to see where missteps are occurring, where you need to be, where you want to be. Are your values aligned with your actions and vice versa? Intent versus impact is really here. And as you begin to dig deeper into this phase of introspection, new life begins. You are more aware, and then you've made a commitment to anti-racist action. What is that, Corey? Like, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. Well, I'm going to tell you, there's some phases to this here. There are some phases. First phase, and I'll just pull out what's in red here. We're talking now interpersonally and institutionally. So there are 4 dimensions of structure of racism, similarly to 4 dimensions of white privilege. So they're running parallel. Those dimensions are, we saw them on the infinity slide: interpersonal, internalized, institutional, and structural. So we're less likely to get to the structure and challenge policy if we're not sort of connected with how our interpersonal shows up in the institution. So let's focus on just those 2 dimensions for the rest of this conversation. And what I like to do is just familiar dysfunction is where people of color begin to feel they need to fit in, right? Predominantly white-led states, white-led organizations, white-led institutions. This is where the learning begins to happen a little. Then you'll make that explicit commitment that I mentioned. Through this explicit commitment, you're holding yourselves accountable as people. You've told someone, you've also made several levels of shifts in in your institution. So develop shared analysis and framework. People of color begin to get regained hope. The culture shift of not knowing is similar to what I mentioned earlier, the tools that we often have to create a policy, to develop a curriculum, to write a program, or to apply for a grant for early childhood or prevention, right? Those tools don't often work in the conversation of race, anti-racism, because there are so many things that we're doing and learning together. It's either or thinking. Embrace that paradox, right? That it's not either or, it's and both. This is where we begin to really see a level of frustration. This is where default button usually comes back. This is an adaptive challenge here, not a technical solution. There's not a box that we can check, not a program that we can implement that's going to get us to equity. This is for the struggle, good people. This is like putting boots on, strapping them up, as we always say about the American values, right? And getting to work. This is about getting to work, doing something that we're not comfortable with doing. And then the people that were in the margins, those people are expecting changes from you. Recognize it. Be aware of it. They're expecting some level of changes because you are expecting a level of change for yourselves. This is where relational trust begins to form. You are now creating opportunities in your environment, your family, your community, your institution, to acknowledge the messiness and chaos. This conversation that we're having today is a microcosm of what can happen in larger spaces on a larger scale. People begin to really sharpen their skills, right? Hold one another accountable. Practice those voice lessons. When I think about trauma and voice lessons again, we try to regulate the voices of Black and brown people so often. You know, the rules that we have, emotional, you know, she's the angry Black woman or he's the angry Black man. They're always talking about race. Well, you know, from a Black person's perspective, I will stop talking about race as soon as you start talking about race. How about that? We can make that deal. I promise you that. Begin to identify individual and collective power. This is where we really begin to make a huge difference. Here, once you go through those phases, you begin to become more poised, understanding of what you can do to create new processes. Remember, we don't always want to fight. This is not about fighting what's already existing. These structures are like frozen power. They're in place. They're there. We have a workaround, and the only way around anything is straight through. So be explicit about your goals, confronting all dimensions of racism at all levels. Those are those 4 dimensions I mentioned: structural, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. You will then be able to gain clarity around the complexities of this work. What I've attempted to do in an hour and a half is cram 400 plus years into a 25-pound bag, right? And it's just impossible to think about these conversations as one and dones. These have to be ongoing examination. And that is equity practice in a nutshell. You'll get to your clarifying goals once you get over familiar dysfunction. Establish an identity for yourselves that are based on your values. And equity practice will be that culture of, it will look like that culture of support where you're learning, right? This is ongoing accountability, a long-term commitment. Think about less saving and rescuing and more learning, right? This is a process of constant learning. When we can begin to measure conversations, when we can begin to measure the impact of learning, when we can begin to utilize qualitative data to infuse our practices, we are indeed focusing on equity. And this equity will also be those intersections, because as you begin to increase the bubble of power, you'll often see that more marginalized people will come when you extend the invite. Those marginalized people may include yourselves. This is where we begin to have that open, honest communication that is transparent. So that I was going to share with you a process to show you that everything that I just mentioned does indeed work. But I'll just say that we took, before I end and open it up, we took an opportunity in South Florida in 2 communities 2 years ago where 6 investigators were removing, child welfare investigators, child protection investigators rather, were removing, these 6 were removing 25 beautiful Black babies from their homes. And 80% of those 25 kids that were being removed were between the ages of 0 and 3. None of those children had experienced anything egregious, sexual, physical, psychological trauma, all neglect related, all based on what we see in Black and brown community. What we've done, we've gone through equity practice, we instrumented what we call the authentic family engagement approach. Through the authentic family engagement approach, we lead with hearts, minds, and humanity. And we created a coaching model where these investigators utilize protective factors as the foundation. This coaching is 2 hours per month. This coaching also sort of drills deeper into accountability and what values mean in practice to help workers go beyond meeting people where they are. But we actually have tangible sample practice indicators that shows what care and compassion looks like when we're active with our families. And what that has done in a 2-year period, we've gone from 25 children being removed per month. Between January 1 and October 1, 2019, we had a total of 17 children were removed. And all 17 children that were removed in that 9-month period needed to be removed. So that is how we make clear, concise decisions that are wise each and every time. We utilize accountability, standards of practice with our families, because we can't will our way out of this. And I'm not utilizing the term accountability from a negative perspective or punitive perspective. Accountability means to be able to understand when it comes to racism, that we all have biases, and how might we live and learn to live with those and create environments where we can recognize and be challenged based on them. And finally, I will say that in order to do better, we have to recognize what it is we already know. And what we know is that our hearts, our minds, and our humanity is terribly disconnected today. However, together, through confronting and this continuous institution and structural analysis, we can go beyond just committing to action, innovation, and transformational change. We can actually begin to lead with love and allow love and our hearts and our outlook for humanity to drive the course. Focus less on the technical and more on the adaptive. And I'll just end with, before I open it up for questions, is that everybody needs somebody, and people, we need one another. And I'll stop there. I think that that's a good stopping point, and I'm curious to know if there are any additional thoughts, comments, or questions. Okay, let's see. How much time do we have before I go too far?
Corey, we have probably a few minutes for questions. We're gonna come back from lunch at 12:50. So if people wanted to stay on, also want to apologize for the little technical glitch that we had, and really encourage people that sometime during your break to watch that brief video we have. But if people, I think if you want to take a few minutes for questions, that would be fine.
Okay, so how about Michelle? That's a healthy question there. Would you like to come off mute? And I'm interested in, I'm also interested in Megan giving us a little bit more enlightening on the intersectionality between racial trauma and systemic racism, individualized trauma and systemic racial trauma. Megan or Michelle, would you care to help me?
Michelle has been invited to unmute. And Megan, I will be looking for her too.
Oh, and Valerie, I didn't see you there earlier. Hello.
Here's Megan.
Hey, Megan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, yeah, I know the term intersectionality, actually when I was in college doing women's studies came up a lot. It's just sort of the idea that, you know, a Black family is experiencing racism on top of whatever the individual is experiencing, same as sexism, classism, mental health struggles, and that one area of privilege doesn't negate the other, or, you know, negate the other. I sort of, sorry, I'm like, wasn't prepared to speak today. But yeah, having privilege in one area does not necessarily negate your experience of struggle in another. Sort of in response to someone earlier talking about her individual trauma and how these conversations can feel hard sometimes when you've experienced trauma in the past. And think that's making sense?
I think it's making sense. I heard you skip a little bit, and you know, this is the latter part. I mean, not the latter part of my life, but I will just I will say that I've learned to be able to speak truth from. I only have one perspective. So let me start by saying I know whiteness, but I don't live in white body. And so living in Black body has taught me that I achieve less when I compare my traumas to others, right? And so this isn't an opportunity to again look at the impact of racism on Black body, but more of an opportunity to uncover the source of said racism. So where I'm going is to really encourage everyone to understand the world according to Corey. This was a conversation that I hoped would expose the source of racial trauma, not the recipient of racial trauma. We study Black and brown individuals and trauma enough, but we don't get at the roots of what causes that trauma. And that goes for adverse childhood experiences, and it also goes for racial trauma. I think in 2020, the racial trauma conversation hasn't really taken off because, again, back to Alicia's point, we somehow quite easily get back into this pathologizing, right? Less about what happened, right? The history will tell us that. What happened to you? How did it happen to you? But my question today is for us to understand who done it? Who is the source of this trauma? And can we begin to understand the power behind that source? If we don't get there, we won't get very far because we're going to continue to look at symptoms and not the root. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Valerie, one more question before we go to, I see you have a question there.
Hello, Corey.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. I actually was saying I'd love to ask you a little later, if you don't mind, offline. But maybe,
Okay.
maybe another time, if that's okay.
That is okay. Absolutely.
But thank you so much. As much as I have gone through a lot of learning and instruction over the years, this was still hugely helpful and informative for me. And I really appreciate the way you organized it and the information you've provided.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Dana, thank you for that linguistic correction. You are absolutely right. What was the source, right? So what occurrences, and I'm glad you picked up there, what occurrences created and established global wealth while perpetuating unintentional accumulated advantages for some and disadvantages for others, right? So the more that we can look at the what as a compilation of ideas, will begin to disrupt. And I think also we may not feel as rebellious and afraid to acknowledge our racial roots. So that is critically important, Dana, and I appreciate that. And so, yes, Maria, you want to take us away?
I was just going to say, with that, I think we probably should wrap up so people get a good break to do what folks need to do during breaks. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and I hope that it spurs new and continued dialogue.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Rourke. I'm the director of New Hampshire Tomorrow at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. We're proud to sponsor today's event. We want to thank you all for participating in this very important conversation. Our New Hampshire Tomorrow project is focused on making sure that kids and families who are furthest from opportunity have access to education, healthcare, and career pathways to ensure that every family thrives. We know in New Hampshire, now more than ever, it's not the case for everybody. We're really honored to continue to support so many nonprofits and community leaders that are working to confront racial, social, and economic injustice. We stand as a partner, and we're happy to be in the fight with you. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the day.
The Children's Trust's key important role is to support family resource centers. We do it through training, we do it through programming so that parents have access to information, to education, to resources. I know in raising my children, community was a huge part of it. It was how everybody acted collectively, how everybody watched all of our children collectively, how everyone exhibited how to care for our children. Supported families are strong families, no matter where they live or what they look like.
When we support our families, we're supporting our communities, and we support our communities, we're supporting our state. And when we support that, everybody is going to benefit, whether they have children or not.
If you had told me when I was 50, I would be bringing up a year-old child, I would have thought, I can't do that. There was puzzles, and there was those toys that make noises that you ride on, and oh my God, doll houses and doll tents. What was preceding all that is the trauma of having a grown son who was in the throes of addiction. We were in the dark. I had no idea how to go about the legalities of guardianship. I just marched myself into the courtroom carrying this infant baby. I said, I need guardianship of my granddaughter. We felt like an island. Nobody needs to do this alone.